Why is there an arrest warrant out for me? I told David the truth. The money was for Whyte's family. Well, Marshall said it was payment for murder. Whyte's been arrested. Wait a minute. What are you talking about? Who's Marshall? Joe explained. He claimed you ordered the killing because Ashcroft was stealing from you. So was Marshall. What? I don't know what's going on, William, but he's turning King's evidence in return for his life, and you're not in a lot of trouble. Lloyd was shell-shocked. I don't believe this. Well, you better believe it. Whyte's going to hang, and you need to start telling me the truth. The truth? The truth is there's not a shred of truth in these claims. Somebody got to Marshall and either scared him or paid him good money to do this. You think Campbell's behind it all? He might be. But I have another theory. Is there a trial date set for Whyte? No, but it'll be soon. He looked steadily at Lloyd. So you've got to sort this out quickly. It took them 15 minutes to reach the other side. They hid the boat among some bushes and headed off across a field. Where are we going to go to? Asked Lloyd. Down to Leith. It's the only place I can think of. Then I know where to go once we're there, said Lloyd. It was midnight by the time they reached Leith. It seemed deserted. The sea shimmered under a full moon, and the boat masts creaked and swayed with the gentle swell. I know a man here. He's the head caretaker at the auction house. He's employed by the Guild. Who are the Guild? The Guild of St. Anthony. They're a society of wine merchants who commissioned the building in the first place. You're going to hide in some damn wine cellar? Not quite. Who goes there? An upstairs window had opened after Lloyd had banged on the caretaker's door. Edward, it's William, he called. William? I'll be right down. A few minutes later, they were being ushered inside. Edward, my dear friend, what's going on? Lloyd looked at Joe. He's in trouble. There's a warrant out for his arrest. The accusations are wrong, and he needs somewhere to hide until they can clear his name. Will you help us? With pleasure. Follow me. Edward led them through his house and down into the cellar. Chapter 9. Elizabeth knocked on the little door. It was opened a few seconds later. Hello, Joe. Elizabeth? Come in. He stood aside as she stepped over the threshold. As soon as the door was closed, he pushed her up against the wall. Their hands were all over each other in an instant, kissing, fondling, grasping, as if they hadn't seen each other in years. In reality, it was mere 2 weeks. I missed you, said Elizabeth between kisses. I missed you, replied Joe breathlessly. Later they lay next to each other on the bed, the muffled sounds of the close on either side of the door. Come with me next time, said Elizabeth. I've always wanted to romp in the heather with a layman. Joe laughed and kissed her. I want adventure, Joe. I want to have fun. Mingling with high society is not fun. It's dull. She kissed him. Let's have fun, Joe. I thought we were. Then let's intensify it. Let's go on a trip somewhere. You and I, this week. Ask my father for time off. We'll hire a horse and trap. We'll get out of the city, into the fresh air. Just ourselves and nature. What do you think? I think it sounds wonderful. But this week is not possible. I don't know when will be. Why? Did your father not tell you about the murder? Elizabeth sat up. What murder? Joe told her about the apprentice. Elizabeth sat and stared at him in shock. Ashcroft was so sweet. He was just a simple man. Dear God. And besides, I would have thought you'd want to be close to your family at this time. She lowered her head. I hate this city. I hate my life. I hate that I'm so tied down. I feel like I'm shackled to my future. My father was never there for me, Joe. Why do I think it's so important to be there for him now? He wants to be married, this man, Walter Johnson. He is scared for me. He is scared about the future. I don't think I've ever met such a pessimistic person than him. The more you have, the more there is to lose. If you have nothing to lose. Joe suddenly took her hand and looked steadily into her face. There's been something I have wanted to talk to you about for a while now. I don't know how to start. He got off the bed and walked to the small, shuttered window. He sat on the sill. I grew up in a family of boys. I had a younger sister, but she didn't live past 2. I have 6 brothers. My mother died shortly after giving birth to the last one, and my father brought us up on his own. He never remarried. I've only ever been close to 2 women in my life, Elizabeth. My mother and you. He looked over at her. I was 7 when she died. My brothers have always been tougher than me. I needed my mother. I needed to be embraced by her. I needed her love. I was always closer to her than I was to my father. When she died, it left a massive hole in my life. Our father toughened us up. He put me through school and sent me into the army to be a man, as he said. And I became the man he wanted me to be, in his eyes anyway. But that little boy still needs his mother. He was looking at the floor as he said this. I need a woman's love, Elizabeth. It is a cruel world out there. I saw what they did to people during the plague. He shrugged. I know they would say they had to, but there is just too much corruption and violence out there. As head of the town guard, my father tried for years to rid that department of corruption, but to no avail. I am determined to follow in his footsteps. Your father is afraid of losing things. Well, so am I. I'm afraid of losing that love, that female touch. Because if I lose that, I don't think I'll be able to cope out there. He came back to the bed. Elizabeth was staring at him. He took both her hands in his. Elizabeth, will you marry me? Elizabeth said nothing. She didn't move, and her expression was not compassionate. Joe, What? You want me to marry you? Joe, I've just told you I'm marrying Walter. But you've never met him. Not yet, no, but that has nothing to do with it. I have to marry whomever my father chooses, whether I like it or not. But Elizabeth, you love me. You've always said, I love you. Where did you get that idea from? Joe frowned. I don't love you, Joe. I'm fond of you, of course, but what we have between us is fun. You know that. Fun? Said Joe incredulously. That's all I am to you? Joe, come on. You must have known that. I was born into society. I cannot be seen to be marrying beneath me. With you, I just want to release. I want passion. You are my layman, my naughty secret. But I do not love you, Joe. Joe was shaking his head. I cannot believe you are saying this. He got off the bed again and began pacing. What we've shared between us, you've used me. From that day we first met, all you were thinking about was yourself. Well, you could get out of this. That is not fair, shouted Elizabeth. Isn't it? What made you think that you could possibly hope to marry me? Because you work for my father? You're a town guard, a poor man. I belong to rich society. Do not think you can take liberties because you are first-name terms with my father. Oh, but it's all right for you to take liberties with me. Who the hell do you think you are? Both stayed in angry silence for a few moments. You know what, Elizabeth? I think you do love me, and I think you're just too scared to admit it. You say you hate your life, but not enough to forfeit all that comfort and wealth. Elizabeth turned her head away from him. I opened myself up to you because I trusted you. You have betrayed that trust in ways that I— Oh, Joe, hissed Elizabeth as she spun her head back round. Your expectations of our relationship are unrealistic to begin with. Don't accuse me of betrayal. What is it your father said? Be a man. The door slammed. Chapter 10. Joe watched from the darkness as Campbell emerged from Mary King's Close onto the high street, where Henderson was waiting with 2 horses. They rode off down towards the Netherbow port. Joe gently urged his own horse out of the shadows and followed at a distance. They passed through the gates ahead of them. A few seconds later, Joe arrived at the port. The Netherbow port was Edinburgh's front door, an awesome gatehouse that told people in no uncertain terms that this was the main entrance to the great capital, grand and imposing. Had any visitor, once inside the walls, chosen to explore the dark, claustrophobic closes hidden behind all those high houses, they might have discovered that Scotland's capital city was not quite as great as perhaps it would have liked. Besides, one could smell it from 2 miles downwind. His colleague was on duty this evening. Good evening, Joe. Duncan, how goes it tonight? Quiet. On your way out? I am. On you go then. I should pay this toll. You know town guards never charge each other. I know. Maybe that should change. He handed over the toll and passed through the gates. He came out onto the dusty main road. There was a full moon tonight, and in the silver light he could see 2 riders away to his left, heading towards Leith. He turned in that direction and followed after them. Joe wanted proof that Campbell was corrupt. If he could discredit him, then perhaps the case against Lloyd would collapse. He suspected that Marshall's confession was part of the plot against Lloyd, orchestrated by Campbell himself. By keeping a close eye on him, Joe hoped to discover something. As he moved after them at an easy pace, he tried not to think about the fact that his life was now nothing worth living. He had been in love with Elizabeth from the very first moment he saw her. For a long time he had hoped that if he impressed Lloyd enough and proved himself to his employer, that he would be able to take Elizabeth's hand in marriage. But now Elizabeth's words had hurt him so much that he felt only anger towards her. He hadn't been sure whether she would accept his proposal or not, but he certainly hadn't expected this outcome. He thought he knew her. Obviously he was wrong. But one thing was for certain: she didn't know herself. The riders up ahead suddenly turned off the road and began heading up onto the Carlton Crags. Joe frowned. "What are they up to?" he muttered. Was it a rendezvous, perhaps? They disappeared up into a dark band of trees. Joe chivied his horse on a bit faster. Campbell and Henderson, once amongst the trees, dismounted their horses and tethered them to a trunk. "He said he would be at the old well at 9, said Henderson. "There he is," said Campbell, pointing through the trees. A lone figure could be seen standing by the low circular wall of stones. Campbell and Henderson approached. "Good evening, gentlemen. Any particular reason you chose this place for a meeting?" "Privacy," replied Campbell. "What's the problem?" asked Argyle. "I think we need to discuss terms. You see, we have a problem. We need to move these goods as soon as possible. I've told you the price. That's what we need to discuss. Unless you can give us a better deal than that, we will have to find somebody else. To go any higher is not worth my while, gentlemen. You say you want to get the silk and candlesticks off your hands, but so will I, and I will not be able to sell what you want me to for any more than 200. The quality is not good enough." He sighed. "Forgive my tone, gentlemen. I have not slept much." "Nor have I," replied Campbell. "There's nothing wrong with the quality. You will raise your price by at least £100, or we will never do business again. In which case I will expose you, Campbell. Expose me, and you expose yourself." Joe was crouched behind a tree a little way off, and could hear nothing of what was being said. But the location was isolated enough for it to be a conversation of interest to him. Who was the man they were talking to, and why was he getting angry? "We had a business deal. You don't just throw that away because of a disagreement. I have to make a living, Campbell. The people that buy from me are fussy about its quality. So far everything has been grand, and I trust you. I trust that you can come up with the goods. I will see what I can do, but I am not promising anything." "When will I hear from you?" asked Campbell. "A few days. I'll speak to my clients, see what deal I can make." The 2 men shook hands. "You understand my concern?" asked Campbell. "Of course. You are a good man, Campbell." Campbell nodded. "Likewise. Good evening, Argyle." "I'll catch up with you, Campbell," said Henderson. "I want to talk to Argyle some more." Campbell nodded. He started heading back towards the trees. Joe watched him untying his horse, and then he was gone. Frustration burned in his chest. He had gleaned nothing from this meeting. He would have to try again. A secret gathering was not grounds for arrest if he had no idea what was being said. "What do we have to talk about?" asked Argyle. "You speak as if you don't like me." "I don't. Nor do I entirely trust you. I know you have your own agenda a lot of the time. Is Campbell aware of that? Maybe it is you that has been advising him to seek another buyer." "You've had your chance, Argyle." As Joe was about to leave, something happened. Henderson had his back to the man. His hands were by his side. His right hand now went into his jacket. In the next second he had spun round and plunged something into the buyer's stomach. Joe only caught a flash of steel as the moon was briefly reflected off its shining surface. Argyle gasped. Henderson thrust the implement deeper into his abdomen, and he collapsed to the ground. Joe stared in horror as Henderson removed the dagger. Then he literally picked up Argyle's body and dropped it into the well. He leaned over the side, and then, seemingly satisfied, dusted off his hands and sat down for a moment on the wall. Joe suddenly found himself staring at the dagger. It was not an ordinary-looking weapon. It looked more ceremonial. Joe stopped breathing as he realized undoubtedly what this meant. His whole body began to tingle. Could this be Lloyd's missing dagger? The connection with Campbell was clear now. He could hardly believe it. He fumbled for his pistol. He was about to make the arrest of his career. His heart pounded. He steeled himself for action and marched out of the trees. "If you value your life, don't move a muscle," shouted Joe. He advanced swiftly towards Henderson. Henderson didn't move. "Throw Lloyd's dagger towards me." Still Henderson didn't move. "Do it now," ordered Joe. "If I value my life?" repeated Henderson. "What sense does that make, as I will hang anyway?" Joe ignored him and repeated his order. Henderson threw it on the ground. "Now get your hands up." "You worked for that bastard Lloyd, don't you?" "Correct." "You killed his apprentice?" "Correct," replied Henderson calmly. "Did Campbell tell you to do that?" "I'm not saying anything more." "That's all right. You don't need to. I'm arresting you for murder. You and I are going to take a nice little stroll back to the toll booth. Get up." Henderson rose. "Why don't you just shoot me?" "That would be illegal." "Not if it was self-defense. I have no desire to live if I have failed to frame Lloyd." "So you do admit that this was your plan, to have Lloyd convicted of murder?" Henderson merely nodded. "Why?" asked Joe. "That's my business. Let's just say it's personal." Joe paused. "What if I had another knife on me, and I suddenly lunged at you like I lunged at Argyle? What would you do then?" Joe narrowed his eyes. "I suppose I would have to shoot you." Henderson smiled coldly. "Why did you kill that man?" "I'd found somebody better." But Campbell was still willing to give him a chance. Pathetic coward that he is. "I'll ask you again then. Did Campbell have anything to do with this business with Lloyd? You might as well tell me the truth." "Campbell may dislike Lloyd, but he is not cold-blooded. I, on the other hand, have no warm blood left in me. No, Campbell had nothing to do with it. He has no idea that I'm involved." "You got Marshall to come forward and testify?" "Correct. It was very necessary. Now go ahead and shoot me." Henderson's hands shot in under his coat again, and out came a small knife. He ran at Joe. Joe's finger squeezed the trigger once. Nothing. Henderson kept coming. He squeezed again. Still nothing. Henderson was on him. He swung the pistol at his head, but Henderson ducked out of the way and lunged at him. Joe at first felt a sharp pain in his upper abdomen, followed instantly by the sensation that he'd been punched hard, and then warmth. He dropped the pistol. Everything seemed to go quiet. And then the sensation was repeated as Henderson stabbed him a second time. He fell to his knees. Henderson crouched down in front of him. "Should have made sure your pistol was loaded, soldier boy. Now you're not going to be able to make that big arrest. That would increase your chances of marrying Elizabeth." He smiled. "Yeah, I know all about you. It's my business to know everything about my quarries. I kill for a living, Joe. You were part of my big backup plan to frame Lloyd." He picked up the ceremonial dagger lying nearby. "Obviously, I didn't expect you to turn up tonight, but now that you're here, let's just get this over with." Henderson drove the ceremonial dagger into Joe's flesh. "It'll be over in a moment," he said. Chapter 11. The carriage was making its way up from Duddingston village. Inside was a doctor returning to the city. It was trundling along gently when all of a sudden it came to a sudden, jarring halt. The horses up front whinnied in surprise. "Doctor!" shouted the driver. The gentleman opened the door and got out. "What the devil is going on?" he demanded. The driver pointed. "Look!" Lying on the road up ahead was a man. He was not moving. "Sir?" shouted the doctor. "Are you all right?" There was no response. The doctor went towards him. It was immediately apparent that the man was either dead or unconscious, and was badly injured. His entire shirt was covered in blood. "My God!" exclaimed the doctor. He squatted down to check for any signs of life. He found a very slight pulse in the man's wrist. "This man needs immediate medical attention," he shouted. "Bring the carriage forward!" The driver cracked the whip and urged the horses on. He jumped down to assist the doctor and immediately recognized Joe. "Do you know him?" asked the doctor. "He's a town guard. He works for William Lloyd." "All right, we have no time to lose. He's lost a lot of blood. It looks as if he's been stabbed." As he stood up, something glinted in the corner of his eye. He turned to look. An object was lying by the side of the road. He helped the driver lift Joe into the carriage and then went over to inspect it. The Lord Provost was woken by his servant. "Your Lordship, I am sorry to wake you, but something has happened." "What is wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "William Lloyd's town guard was attacked tonight. He has been taken to Dr. Coburn's house. He is in bad shape." The Provost threw back his covers and leapt out of bed. "Has Campbell been informed?" "I believe so, Your Lordship. Have my carriage ready as soon as possible." 10 minutes later the Provost entered a small upstairs room in Coburn's house. Joe was lying on a bed, his head sunk into a pillow. But for the features of his face, he would not have been distinguishable from the pillow-case. He was white as a sheet, and totally motionless. Dr. Coburn stood over him. He nodded towards the Provost as he entered. "Your Lordship?" "How is he?" asked the Provost breathlessly. "Bad," replied the doctor. "He is unconscious due to blood loss. Unfortunately, I cannot tell exactly how much blood is lost, nor how to supplement it. I have stitched up the wound and cleaned it. I have sent for his brother, Darren. The rest of his kin are either dead or scattered across Scotland. What about Lloyd?" "That is not as simple. Lloyd is in hiding at the moment. He is wanted for murder." Dr. Coburn stared at him. "I had no idea. Oh, by the way, I found the weapon used. It was lying near the body. The attacker must have dropped it." He turned to a servant girl at his side. "Temperance, would you fetch it from my study for the Provost?" "Yes, sir," she said, with a quick curtsy, and hurried from the room. She returned shortly, with the implements wrapped in a piece of cloth. The Provost opened the bundle. He seemed to stare at it for a long time. His face wore an odd expression. "Interesting choice for a weapon, don't you think? Looks like a ceremonial dagger." Yes, it does." He wrapped it up again. "Thank you. I will... Are you all right?" asked Colburn. The Provost looked like he was about to collapse. "Do you, have brandy in the house? I feel I could do with some of that." "Of course. Temperance, would you—" Temperance was nearly at the door when pounding footsteps were heard on the stairs. The door burst open and in rushed Elizabeth. She flew towards the bed. "Joe!" she screamed. The doctor caught her. "Calm yourself, child." She was hysterical. Behind her came Darren. "What has happened?" he asked. "He's been stabbed." "No!" shrieked Elizabeth. She struggled to get out of the doctor's grip. Tears were pouring down her face. Her cheeks were flushed with passion. "You must come with me downstairs. Come on. You must come away. He is in good hands. Come on now." "I'm sorry, Joe. I'm sorry," she sobbed, as she was led downstairs. Coburn took her into the living room and sat her down on a lang settle. The Provost saw the array of decanters and poured 2 glasses, one for himself and one for Elizabeth. "Drink this," he told her. But Elizabeth refused it. Who has done this to him?" she asked, her face buried in the doctor's chest. "We don't know," replied the Provost. I want my father. I want my father. Where is my father?" The Provost sighed. "This is not an easy time for you right now. I'm afraid that what I have to tell you is not going to make it any easier. Your father is under suspicion for murder. Possible evidence has come to light that he is responsible for the death of—" "How dare you!" shrieked Elizabeth. "How dare you accuse my father of anything so despicable?" "Elizabeth, I assure you—" "No! How can you sit there and say that to my face? You, the godfather of my brothers!" The Provost tried to take her by the shoulders. "Elizabeth," she slapped his face hard. "Don't you touch me!" The Provost stood up. He drained his glass in an instant and left the room. Elizabeth shouted curses at his back before bursting into a fresh storm of tears. As the Provost passed through the doorway, he encountered Campbell. Elizabeth ran to him. "Tell me this is not true about my father." "I have no definite answers. I only know that he is now in hiding. And if you know where, then you must tell me, so we can get to the truth." "I know nothing," she said in despair. And then she collapsed. "Keep her here," said the Provost. "I will be back." "Where are you going?" asked Campbell. "Errands." "We need to talk," said Campbell. "As I said, I will be back." Campbell followed him to the front door. "Where is he?" he asked in a low voice. "Where's who?" asked the Provost. Who do you think? The provost cleared his throat and squared his shoulders. Now listen very carefully, Mr. Campbell. If you're implying that I have in some way tried to pervert the course of justice, then I would think long and hard before you make your next accusation. And with that, he strolled out into the night. He went straight to the nunnery. How are they, Mary? Her expression immediately gave him cause for concern. Mary, what is it? The infant did not survive. The provost sighed deeply. Oh, God. She doesn't know, said Mary quietly. He nodded slowly. Do you want me to tell her? Perhaps that would be best, she said. The provost approached the bed where Catherine lay. How are you today, Catherine? Where is Euphemie? She asked. Where is my baby? The provost sat down next to her. He took her hand in his. Euphemie is with God now, my dear. Catherine shook her head. No, she began. I'm so sorry, Catherine. I'm so sorry. Mary heard Catherine screaming as she walked along the stone passage. The cries of anguish echoed in her ears as she squeezed the cross around her neck. The provost sat with Catherine for an hour, trying to give her comfort. He had almost forgotten what he'd come for. Catherine, I know this is the wrong time to ask you, but I wonder, do you recognize this? He removed the cloth containing the ceremonial dagger from the folds of his cloak and unwrapped it. The doctor had washed the blood of it. Catherine stared at it briefly before saying, Of course. It is the knife you gave William when you made him a bailie. Why? The provost forced a smile. It is not important. How is William? She asked. He is well, replied the provost, patting her on the arm. He is well. It is my fault. I killed our child with my foolishness. Fresh tears came into her eyes. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I love him. You can tell him yourself when you get better. That may not happen. Marshall looked up from his straw pile as the door opened and the jailer entered with a plate of food. Because he was turning King's evidence, he was being treated slightly better than the other inmates. Good evening, said the jailer amicably. I brought you some of my dinner, he said. Thank you. Everyone calls me Barney. Thank you, Barney. It was beef and vegetables. The jailer sat down on a stool for a moment and watched him eat. It was very brave what you did, Marshall. Marshall paused mid-chew and looked up at him. He shook his head. No, I'm a coward. Always have been. I've never done the right thing. No one wants me or respects me. I cling to other people in order to survive. The jailer folded his arms and looked at the stone floor. You know, I always say, you're someone's child. Someone cared about you once. Maybe still does. I never knew my mother. As soon as she had me, she was dragged away and executed in the Norloch. They stuck me in an orphanage. No, Barney. No one wanted me. At that moment there was a creak at the door and Campbell entered, followed by Elizabeth. Good morning, Barney. He turned to Marshall. I brought someone to see you. You be nice. She's Lloyd's daughter. Marshall stood up. Good evening, ma'am, he said quietly. Did you accuse my father of this terrible thing? Marshall gently nodded. My father is a kind man, an educated man. He is a bailie of the city and a friend of the Lord Provost. He would never do such a thing. He is not capable of it. So I have come to ask you, sir, to retract your false testimony against my father. It is not false. Look, she said, I don't know who you are or what my father has supposedly done to you, but I promise you this. If you retract your statement, I will make sure you are detained no further. It is not a false statement, said Marshall again. I don't believe you. I don't care. Marshall, said Campbell in a warning tone. Your father is guilty of this crime, missy, and I'm not going to back down just because you come in here with your fancy clothes and look at me like I'm a parasite. You are a parasite, she hissed. Go to hell, bitch. That's enough, shouted Campbell. I think it's best if you left now, ma'am, said Barney, trying to keep the peace. Elizabeth turned on her heels. As she reached the door, she turned back. My father will clear his name, and when he does, you're going to be... "You can be in here for the rest of your sorry little existence." Marshall spat in her direction. In a blind fear, she made a move to strike him, but Barney caught her. "That's enough, ma'am. Get your filthy hands off me," she snapped. She stormed out of the cell, leaving a sourness in the air. "I told you to be nice," said Campbell, and followed after her. Marshall was fuming. "I'm sorry about that," said Barney. Marshall slumped down on his straw pile and covered his face. "I'll leave you in peace," said Barney. But before he left, he said, "By the way, something you should know. Your mother wasn't executed. She escaped to Germany." Marshall stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I helped her escape. I'm your father, Marshall." "Please, I need to live," begged the woman. Her begging fell on deaf ears. They dragged her over to the makeshift gallows that stood outside the town guard's booth on the high street. They bound her hands behind her back and secured the rough noose around her neck. "Oh, God, please," were her final words before they kicked the stool from under her. Those words were still ringing in Lloyd's ears as he woke with a start. He lay in the dark cellar, his heart pounding, his breath coming in rasps. It took him a moment to remember where he was. He sat up in the pitch black and listened for any sounds. "Oh, God, please!" A shiver ran through his body. Just a nightmare, he told himself. But he couldn't get back to sleep. He lay awake for the next 2 hours, thinking about his situation. He thought about Elizabeth, too. How was he supposed to save his family from the jaws of extinction without marrying her off to a rich man? His father would never forgive him if he let the family line die out. Lloyd's mother had died when he was 8, and Lloyd Sr. could not bring himself to remarry. All his hopes and dreams had been pinned on his only son, William. Of course, remarriage was the only other option. His father was a fool, in Lloyd's opinion. All the pressure had been mounted on him to succeed. He started to focus his thoughts on Annie and her brother. The chances were that Annie's brother had tried to frame Lloyd in vengeance for abandoning his sister, thus forcing her to marry the clergyman. But was Annie aware of this? If she was, why write that letter? It would only incriminate her, unless she wanted him to make the connection and didn't care about what the consequences would be. He had to investigate. He had to clear his name and find out the identity of the true culprit. And he had to save Whyte from the hangman. Whyte stared at the 4 walls of his cell in a state of complete despair. He wasn't afraid of death. He wasn't even afraid of the pain. All he was afraid of was what would happen to his family. He had let them down now for a second time. What kind of husband and father was he? Maybe he deserved this. Whyte had come from a poor background. His earliest memories were of sweeping in the close outside his family's lake house, aged 5, in order to help bring in the money. He had no education. His entire life had been one long, constant struggle for survival. Agnes worked in the fish market off the high street, which was where he had first met her. He had eventually taken her off for a drink in his favourite tavern, and their relationship had sweetened from then on. But Whyte's drinking habits had already begun to take hold of him. By the time their first 3 children were born, Whyte was drinking far too much. He'd started to sell tobacco to fuel his craving, not noticing that his new family were suffering as a result. And then there had been the eviction. That had shaken him up. By that time, he had 6 children, and his wife was expecting their 7th. He needed to sort himself out. At that moment, the door to his cell opened and the jailer came in. "You've got a visitor," he said gruffly. When he saw her, Whyte forgot his chains and tried to run towards her, but the shackles stopped him, the cold iron digging into his ankles. Agnes ran into his arms, kissing him madly, tears already rolling down her face. "You've got half an hour. That's it." When Barney left, they slumped down onto the straw pile. "Oh, John." "It's all right. I'm all right." "I don't understand what is going on. Why are you suspected of murder?" "I don't understand myself, but I swear to you, I killed no one." "Of course you didn't, my darling." She wiped tears from her eyes. "The children are scared out of their wits. They keep thinking more men are going to come storming into the house again. They are scared that I'm going to be taken away as well. I can barely give them any words of comfort." "You tell them I am well. And you tell them I will be back soon." Agnes looked into his eyes. "Will you?" she asked. Whyte lowered his head. I cannot promise anything." She grabbed him suddenly and held on as tight as she could. "I can't go on without you, John," she declared in a frightened, desperate voice. "Yes, you can. And you will. For the children. For me. Promise me you will do that if the worst should happen." "I promise." He kissed her. "If I go to the gallows, never let your children think I did this. Never." Barney listened outside the door of Whyte's cell. He was an eavesdropper, often listening in to private conversations such as these. It sometimes helped him glean information that he could pass on to Campbell. Barney had worked as an informant for Campbell for many years. He was with him the day he heard his brother had been killed. He went back now to Marshall's cell and closed the door. He was off duty, and this was the first time he had seen his son in 25 years. "You look like your mother, Samuel. You ever knows. Where did you meet her? Tell me. I know nothing of her." "I know very little either. I met your mother when she was brought in here for questioning. She'd been found by 2 Baileys standing over the body of her late husband, Alexander Kincaid, and with her, her mother, Abigail. On the floor in front of Abigail was a bloodied fire poker. The women were immediately arrested and brought here. Your mother, Helen, her name was, pleaded innocent. She said it was an argument between her mother and her husband, which had got out of control. Before she knew it, her mother had picked up the poker and hit him over the head. They hadn't believed her. Both women were charged with murder and detained in the toll booth to await trial. But I believed her. Maybe it was her frightened face, her pleading look, I don't know. But she begged me for help, and I gave it to her. There is a law that states you cannot harm an unborn child. So what better way to stave off execution than to get pregnant? It gives you an extra 9 months. I'm sure this is not exactly what you wanted to hear, Samuel, but it is the truth. And I did care about her. It was not lust. It was the sadness of seeing a beautiful young woman in despair. That fact that over the years I had seen so many go to their deaths over what was most likely trumped-up charges. Bailey's are good at doing that. Marshall played with a piece of straw and did not look up. We waited, with bated breath. The trial date arrived 2 weeks later. She was found guilty along with her mother and sentenced to death by drowning in the Norloch. It was then Helen told them she was with child by her late husband. The judge had a doctor examine her and found her to be telling the truth. Her life was spared for just now, but as soon as the baby was born, she would die. Her mother was put to death the very next day. Meanwhile, Helen was given into the care of her sister. Somehow she had to escape. Helen was in a state of distress. Because of this, you were born 2 months early. She was now terrified. The doctor was coming to see her next day. We had to get her out. Helen's brother-in-law had a large collection of beer barrels in the cellar. They were replenished every so often by the brewer, who would then take away the empty casks. By sheer luck, I was not working that evening. Her sister already knew I was the father. I sneaked round to the house to see mother and child, and we came up with a plan to get her out in one of these empty barrels. He would be concealed in the house. Her brother-in-law went to fetch the brewer, while we secured your mother. When he arrived, he was paid to keep his mouth shut. The empty barrels were going to the Coopers in Leith. There she would be put on a boat, bound for a foreign country. 2 months later, her sister received a letter from Helen, saying she was in Germany. Marshall raised his head. Like you said, you helped her escape. You saved her life. I thank you for that, Barney. He rose to his feet. And now you have to help me escape too. You do not need to. You're turning King's evidence. You will be granted freedom. Really. I do not trust that Lord Provost. Lloyd is clearly a friend of his. I know how corrupt the system is. Barney shook his head. It is not possible, my boy. No, you will have to wait this one out. And besides, I work for Campbell. You have nothing to fear. Chapter 13. Lloyd left Edward's house early the next morning and boarded a carriage that would take him to Duddingston. On the journey there, his thoughts were on nothing but Annie and what he remembered of her. She had red hair. That was the first thing he remembered. She smiled a lot, especially at the customers. Her father owned the inn. He had bought it from the last owner for £200. They were a rich family. Annie's grandfather was an Edinburgh lawyer, one of the most successful of his time, and her great-grandfather too. Her great-grandfather had been in the crowd that watched Mary Queen of Scots leave the city for Loch Leven in 1567. He had owned several estates in East Lothian that had been passed down through the years. Annie was a happy, free-spirited girl with a privileged upbringing. Her older brother, Roger, doted on his younger sister, and would have done anything for her. But soon Lloyd had noticed a change in Annie. She ceased to be her carefree self. She stopped smiling at the customers. One evening Lloyd had inquired what the matter was. "My father has found a suitor for me," she said. "That's wonderful." "No, William, it is far from wonderful. It is the local clergyman, and he is 20 years older than I am. I want nothing to do with that man. He comes in here and drinks regularly. My father and he are on very good terms. He always sits in the same seat and drinks nothing but claret all night." She lowered her voice now. "And besides, I have heard rumours. Apparently he was not always a man of the cloth. In his youth he was part of a criminal gang that terrorised local residents. The clergyman at the time took him under his wing and is said to have converted him to the Christian way. But some say he is still as crooked today as he was then, and is merely hiding behind religion. What am I to do? I don't dare argue with my father on this matter. He will be furious. He says it is my duty to marry whomever he chooses. I know the clergyman is only after the dowry, which is huge. £900 on one of our estates." As the weeks went on, Annie had become more and more desperate. Finally she had come to him. "My father likes you," she said. "You yourself are from a wealthy background and have high aspirations." "What are you saying, Annie?" "Perhaps he will consider you as a husband." Lloyd laughed. "Me? I don't think so." "Why not? You're closer to my age, at least. You're a good employee." "Well, whether he would or not is beside the point. I have my own plans laid out, and they do not include you. I am sorry." The night before he had left, Roger had tried to persuade him to accept his sister's offer. "Can you not see that this marriage is not going to work? I have never seen my sister this unhappy. My father's mind is set. He will not listen to anything I say." "Then what makes you think I can change his mind?" said Lloyd. "I don't love your sister, Roger. Why should I jeopardise my future career because she pouts her lips at me? None of this is my problem, and I refuse to be drawn into it." As he prepared to leave the following morning, Annie had begged him one last time. "I will tell you only one thing, Annie. Your father is right. You should be marrying whom he chooses. You need to grow up and accept that." Those had been his last words to her. They were harsh words. He had ridden away that morning without giving her another thought, and he had never thought about her since, until he had read her note. Clearly he had always been on her mind. What had she gone through over the years to make her so angry? It was 9 o'clock in the morning when he had arrived in Duddingston. The driver dropped him off outside the inn. He entered now for the first time in years. It had hardly changed. He approached the bar. "Good morning. May I speak to the landlord?" "Young Master Lloyd," said a voice. "My God, is that really you?" Lloyd turned. In front of him was an elderly gentleman, his back slightly bowed. "It is I, Mr. McGrath. Indeed it is. How are you, good sir?" His old employer shook his hand warmly. "Frail but fair is the answer to that one. And how are you?" "I cannot complain. How is Annie?" "You can ask her. I am expecting her shortly with her husband." "Is that so?" replied Lloyd. "Ah, I do believe that is them now." Lloyd turned slowly as Annie, accompanied by her husband, entered the inn. "Good morning to you," said the clergyman. "Ah, good morning, Clarence. It is always a pleasure to see you." Annie and Lloyd stared at each other. They said nothing. Annie's face wore an undescribable expression. If he could describe it, Lloyd might have used the word shocked. They continued to stare at each other for several moments. Lloyd could distinctly see the bruise on her left cheekbone. He could also see that her entire countenance had changed, from carefree to careworn. Her posture was more rigid, as if she were desperately trying to hold herself together. "Annie, you remember Mr. Lloyd, don't you?" "Of course," she replied quietly. "William, I'd like to introduce you to Clarence, my son-in-law." Lloyd shook hands with the clergyman. They were big hands. He had a strong grip. "A pleasure to meet you," said Lloyd. "Likewise," replied the clergyman, smiling. "Annie, my dear girl, what happened to your face? Have you fallen again?" "Yes, father." "What was it this time?" "The stairs," said the clergyman. "That combined with her skirts and perhaps a little too much drink." "Really, my dear, you must take better care of yourself." "Yes, father," said Annie again, in the same tone as before. She flashed Lloyd a glance as she said this. "Mr. Lloyd, you will stay for breakfast, won't you?" "That's very kind of you. I would love to." As he joined the three of them round the table, he immediately felt the tension. Although Annie never looked at him, he knew she was acutely aware of him watching her. She looked awkward, as if she were embarrassed or humiliated, and that humiliation came from being under her husband's authority. She sat next to him, almost right up against his body. Their chairs were that close, as though he had her on a leash. When she ate slowly, with little mouthfuls, and seemed to have difficulty swallowing. Before the meal was over, Lloyd excused himself from their company and left the inn. He walked dejectedly along the lane. What had that bastard done to her? That was not the Annie he had known. Suddenly, two men stepped out of a doorway he had passed, and then began following him. A little further along, two other men came from a side street. They also began walking towards him. And then Lloyd realized he was walking down a close, not a lane that led somewhere, but a close that led nowhere, with four men on his trail. He turned suddenly and faced them. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "It's not what they can do for you," said a voice. "It's what you can do for me." Lloyd spun round. Stepping out of a doorway up ahead was Roger McGrath, Annie's doting old brother. "And what is that?" asked Lloyd defiantly. "You can turn round and get back on that coach you came on, just like you did 20 years ago. Back then, of course, we wanted you to stay. Now you can just go. We don't want you here anymore." "That's fair enough. But I might have a few questions for you." "Such as?" "Did you kill him?" McGrath frowned. "Say again?" Lloyd clenched his fists. "Did you kill him?" he repeated angrily. "Did I kill who?" McGrath looked genuinely confused. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You lying son of a bitch!" snapped Lloyd. McGrath took a step forwards. "What did you say?" "I said you were a lying son of a bitch." McGrath swung a punch at him. It caught him right across the side of his face, and he fell onto the cobbles. McGrath was on top of him in a second. He grappled him by the throat. "And you left my sister to rot!" he yelled. "If I was going to kill anybody, it'd be you! And that fucking man of the cloth! Oh, man of the drink! He's a raging alcoholic and wife-beater! Leave him!" McGrath looked up. Annie was coming towards them down the close. McGrath rose. "Annie, you shouldn't be here. Be quiet, Roger." She looked straight at Lloyd. "You got my note, then?" Lloyd nodded. "I got your note." "What note?" asked McGrath. "What are you talking about?" "I think Mr. Lloyd would like to talk to me in private," said Annie. 10 minutes later they stood on the shore of Duddingston Loch and stared out over that calm body of water. They didn't speak to each other. It was as if they were acclimatizing themselves to being in each other's company again after all those years. Or perhaps they just didn't know what to say. At last Lloyd spoke. "Annie, I am so sorry." She did not immediately reply. "I would almost say your apology is too late. I have already been to hell and back." She looked at him. "Would you care to hear my description of it?" Lloyd said nothing. "Let me tell you then. It is no different from what my husband says. I have seen flames, so close that they shriveled my hair. I have seen red-hot pokers that burn the flesh on my back. I have seen a demon. I see him almost every waking hour of my life. I even see him in my dreams. This demon throws me into dark cellars when I displease him. He beats me for pleasure. He dominates every aspect of my being. Every muscle I have fears him. I cannot stand his touch. I tremble at every syllable he utters, and yet I cannot leave him. That is what hell is, William. Lloyd closed his eyes in despair. Could you not explain all this to your father? She smiled sadly. Clarence knows how to perform. He does it every Sunday in that pulpit. He is a pious and charitable man in this village. Who is going to believe me over him? Not my father, I can assure you that. He will not hear a negative word spoken about Clarence. But the bruises, only occasionally does my husband use his fists. Usually it is the flat of his palm, so it leaves no marks. And if I ever spoke out against him, Clarence would come up with his own story that would completely contradict mine, and then he would punish me severely. Why did he use his fist this time? Asked Lloyd. The house that my father gave him was burnt to the ground last week. There is nothing left of it. And out of the £900, there is only £100 left. So he took his anger out on me. As I told you once, he only married me for the dowry. Your brother seems very protective of you. I'm surprised he does not try to intervene. He does. It was he and his men that burnt the house. Clarence had many barrels of fine wine and ale in the cellars there. The whole thing was a prime target designed to hit him hard. Roger once spoke to my father at length about Clarence's treatment of me. He dismissed him. So Roger and his men broke into the church and smashed the place to bits. My father never forgave him. He will not speak to Roger now. So you see, I can do nothing. I wrote you that note after this latest beating. Every time he hurts me, I look at a cameo of you I had made, secretly. It lies behind a hidden panel in the wall. She laid a hand on his arm. I love you, William. I always have. When I asked you to become my suitor, it was not just because I didn't want to marry Clarence. Lloyd now put his arms gently around her and drew her in to his chest. She did not resist. I wanted to see you again. Somehow I knew you would come if you told me how mad you were at hating me. She nodded. Why? Perhaps because I knew you would relish another chance to tell me how pathetic I was. Lloyd felt a pang of guilt. I was too harsh on you 20 years ago. I was a young man full of aspirations and dreams, and I wasn't interested in you. I thought you were immature, and I'm sorry. I wish things were different. I wish everything was different. Do you have to get back to the city? She asked. He shook his head. No. Why? Clarence and my father are going to London this afternoon. Will you stay with me tonight? Of course, replied Lloyd. Elizabeth sat by Joe's bed, keeping vigil. Her eyes were red from crying. Joe had made no signs of movement, or sign that he was aware of what was going on around him. Dr. Coburn was extremely concerned. There is nothing more I can do for him. The only thing I can think of is to send him to an associate of mine. He's been experimenting with blood transfusions, taking blood from one person to another. Joe needs more blood. If he doesn't get it, he will die. Elizabeth nodded. Where is this associate of yours? He lives out along the coast of North Berwick. It will take maybe 2 hours to get there. When can we leave? What are the chances he will make it? Asked Campbell from the doorway. I cannot say, replied Coburn. Joe knows where Lloyd is. He hid him. Whether this attack has anything to do with it, I do not know. I gave the murder weapon to the provost. He seemed upset by it. In what way? Asked Campbell. He took one glance at it and almost at once looked like he was going to faint. Campbell frowned. What type of knife was it? Some sort of ceremonial dagger. I want to go with him, said Elizabeth. Of course, my dear, replied Coburn. I'll get a carriage from Whyte Close, said Campbell. As he left the house, his mind was racing. He was putting it all together now. The provost had made Lloyd a bailey 3 years ago. At the ceremony, it was customary to present the new appointee with a ceremonial dagger representing strength and authority. Each one of these daggers was unique to the individual bailey. Lloyd had tried to kill Joe with his dagger, most likely because he knew of his employer's guilt. The provost had recognised the dagger and realised what it meant. The question was, what was he going to do now? Would he go public with it, or would he bury it? Campbell needed to speak to him. First, though, he needed to speak to Henderson. He pulled himself up those hellish steps towards his apartment and banged on the door, his legs like jelly. Henderson let him in. Campbell briefly explained the situation and then gave him his orders. Go with him. Make sure everything goes smoothly. I need the information as soon as possible. I'll stay here and persuade the provost to do the right thing. We must secure a conviction. I understand, said Henderson. I'm going to go to the carriage. I'll meet you outside the doctor's house in 20